Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Week 7, Lecture 1, Political Development and Political Economies. As in all cases, you need to spend a lot of time reading the textbook chapter and reading the lecture notes, which are kind of like an alternative text as well, as you prepare for a topic like political development. Political development is one of the most important, yet one of the most controversial topics we'll study this semester. And it's controversial because everyone wants it, but there are different ways to obtain it. Now, there may be a few who don't want it, but if you want to increase human flourishing, political liberties, and cash in your pocket, development is a natural and good thing. What is development? Development is the idea that nations become more modern, more sophisticated by obtaining certain capacities and capabilities. Now, the term is also very controversial because there are those scholars who think that we need to look at development differently, not just the way that we have accomplished economic development in the United States, but the way other countries develop differently from us, or how they develop differently from Western Europe or differently from Japan. One of the great scholarly advances in understanding how development takes place was offered by a scholar by the name of Rostow, and he looked at 6 stages of development. First stage is development often takes place in a traditional society or a relatively unadvanced or less developed country, and they don't have the capabilities and capacities to advance their economic system. Secondly, Rostow talked about the preconditions for takeoff. And takeoff is a very important term when it comes to development. Takeoff means there is a rapid advancement of the economic system, usually corresponding with rapid takeoff of political liberties as well, and general wherewithal of this regime and increased wealth of the citizens. Rostow said for a country to move from a traditional society to a more developed society, that there must be certain preconditions. Usually it's it's an expansion of agriculture, more scientific capability in that country, and more economic output, sort of like the Industrial Revolution that happened in 18th century America and what happened in other parts of the world, and is taking place right now in other parts of the world. The third stage of development is what is called takeoff. This is a rapid rise in gross domestic product. That's the amount of wealth that a society, political system, a country creates, and that is a sign of usually rapid modernization, rapid technological advancement, and the like. Okay, stage 4 of uh, Rostow's model is the drive to technology. Basically, you develop more of a technological society, you can advance more, you have more advancement. Fifth stage is what's called high mass consumption. Economy that produces a lot of economy. The economy is based upon consumer goods, services, and this is kind of the full development of an economic or political system. We often use terms like modernization and uh, development as the same. They are very similar. Some scholars don't agree with that and suggest that development is an evolutionary process. Modernization actually can happen separately. It's just advancement of technology that can come from other countries. So you can have development, some scholars argue, but you may not have modernization. On the other hand, you might have modernization but not development. For example, there are countries in the less developed world, sometimes we call it third world today, and those countries or people in those countries are able to communicate unlike they ever have before because of the rise and the relatively inexpensive nature of cell phones, satellite phones, and other kinds of devices. Also, modernization can come without development, and that you have areas where there is the availability of computers, and those computers are uh, often much simpler than what developed countries would use, but it gives individuals access to greater knowledge and able to uh, enhance their lives and develop without tremendous economic development. We use a number of ways of assessing and understanding economic development. One of those is what we call the OECD standard. This is a classification by the United Nations Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're going to talk about some of those categories. One of those, and so we're going to use some of those terms that are normal and part of comparative politics. Uh, but the OECD, one basic category they uh, discuss and are as part of the understanding of comparative politics is it's called NICS, newly industrialized countries. These are a small number of countries, typically in Asia, that have developed in your lifetime and in my lifetime very quickly. So within the last half century, let's say. Um, and there another model that's used is what's called underdeveloped countries. We often call these third world countries. Most of the world is in this category in terms of political development, economic development. About three-fourths of the countries in the world are in this category. Even countries that we consider uh, highly developed in one way can still be relatively undeveloped in others. For example, the most prominent example I would say is China. It's 25% of the world's population, second largest economy. You still have large areas of China that are still living a sort of pre-industrial and rural life, and this is very important. Also, um, there are many countries in the world that still are attached to their former colonizers. And by that we mean countries that under which these colonies once operated but now become independent. Colonialism is a very important aspect of the study of international politics. It tends to become a kind of cult-like topic in the 21st century among scholars, but it is more complicated than most of the studies of colonialism in the 21st century would suggest. Um, in fact, we can't really understand many of these countries, their borders, their cultures, their resentments, their successes without understanding that and colonial relationship. And that colonial relationship was not always the same in terms of the relationship to the colonizing country. For example, England, which we think of as a fairly weaker country in the international system in the 21st century, once had colonized about 25% of the world. So they had tremendous influence, tremendous power. There were different patterns of colonialism, is one thing to consider. The colonies are no longer part of, former colonies are no longer part of the so-called mother country, but they still very often have a relationship. Sometimes it's a positive relationship, sometimes it's a negative, and sometimes it's still quite complicated. Um, Most Latin American countries, and speaking of South America, of course, obtained their independence in the 19th century, although most African countries were still under colonial rule until um, those years following World War II, which is, in terms of world politics, fairly recent, fairly recent development. Um, since the period of decolonization, we have many, many more countries. And while the UN allows recognition for about 200 countries, in terms of real function economies, we're talking about a smaller number, perhaps 175 or 180. So please keep that in mind. One of the other key insights is that political and economic development, most students of comparative politics believe goes hand in hand. As the economy grows, as you move through those Rostow stages, you have greater political and social liberty. Now, this is not always the case. This is not a guarantee, but this has been a standard. One of the great challenges to that theory has been the rapid economic growth uh, of the People's Republic of China. So that regime's growth has not always uh, produced the kind of political liberties that we would anticipate. And now we're speaking of the development of a regime that is now over 70 years old. Let's talk about economic development. What does that mean? What does that entail? One term we use is gross national product. That is the total value of goods and services produced by the state, produced by that government um, within its borders. We also look at GNP, and there's GDP, gross domestic product, and then gross national product, gross domestic product, the overall value, gross national product, the product produced within the country. We usually, the standard form of statistical analysis, and look at GNP per capita. It's the amount of revenue and goods that each person in the society receives, which is also very important and fluctuates tremendously in the world. We also look at the different levels of industrialization as we talk about economic development. And the study notes have this at great length with primary, secondary, and tertiary production. And these are very important to know. And typically, primary production would mean agriculture, secondary production would mean manufacturing and industrial products, and tertiary is the transition from manufacturing to service, like we have seen in all the modern or contemporary, would be more accurate, Western democracies and parts of Asia, where we've gone full force. So these are the levels of industrialization. Uh, when we study economic development, we also study the underdevelopment syndrome, how some countries have not developed over time, and what causes that, and what are the factors involved in that. Poor economic structure, lack of skilled personnel, um, low productivity, um, monoculture, where the country has become absorbed or fixated with producing one product and are unable to diversify. The general rule of thumb when it comes to economic development is the more diversified you are, the better off you are, because you can withstand a decline in one industry and still have a vibrant, active economy. Productivity, relationship to international trade, and population growth. Population growth is very, very important. We speak of demography as a study of populations, and this is a field that's shared with political science and with sociology, um, and social development. Again, there are a number of statistical models that the textbook and the lecture notes talk about. One of how we measure this, how we measure social and political development and economic development. One of them is called the Gini coefficient. This is a relative degree of socioeconomic inequality within a country. Perfect equality is 0, while maximum equality is much higher. This index, the greater degree of the socioeconomic equality, um, the greater the number, the degree, the higher the number, the higher degree of inequality. We also talk about Human Development Index. This is United Nations data that's very important for assessing really the economic development and the economic productivity of a country, which is very critical. Um, there are a lot of factors that relate to economic development. But the hope is always for economic takeoff of a country so that it can advance and again encourage human flourishing, growth of political and social freedom. So let's talk a little bit. We've talked about economic development. Let's talk about political development. What does political science research suggest that we need? Well, you got to have stable government. That's number one, because you have a stable government, you can't really run factories. You can't grow crops. The government can't help the citizens. Citizens can't enjoy full lives. All these factors come into play. So if your country is in the midst of a serious political conflict, whether it be um, North versus South Sudan, which is now which is a actually now a unified state that is working out these tensions, sometimes not very well. Our place that is in utter turmoil, as we have seen many countries in the 21st century, you're probably not able to have a stable economy. You're not able to have a takeoff. Uh, and, and it's very important that if you have stability, that regime stay in power for a period of time. It also requires some, what we call in American context, a separation of powers or differentiated political institutions. Institutions that specialize in certain roles, representing certain constituencies, that serve uh, uh, that serve to balance and divide the power of government. Also, the people's interest, regardless of whether it is an authoritarian or democratic or authoritarian, or totalitarian government, or whatever version of political rule we have, stability is good for economic and now also for political development. We tend to believe that the interests of the citizens must be represented. Therefore, we need interest groups, we need political parties, all the things that we have been studying. So, what causes political development not to take place? Well, for some of these same reasons that we might imagine, some of these same reasons that we're looking at. Weak governments, uh, human rights issues. The government itself is abusing the citizenry, are allowing the military to abuse the citizenry, or some version of that. Citizens are allowed basic rights to carry out their lives, to live their lives as they would like. Sometimes there's significant ethnic conflict. We know, for example, in Rwanda for the last 25 years, economic activity is very difficult because there's a civil war. And it's very hard to reconcile that civil war. Also, you have class conflict. If you have a small group of people who own most of the wealth, then you have resentment, you have a challenge to that. Also, sometimes in large parts of the world, certainly in Latin America and in Asia, within uh, the last 40 years, we've had the installation of military regimes. And this is certainly the case in Africa as well. In fact, one might argue that no part of the world is uh, protected from that possibility. Sometimes military assumes leadership of a country when there is great instability. Sometimes it's because of the corruption of the political leadership. Sometimes it's the it's leadership aspirations of some of the military leaders. Um, and so this also becomes a factor in political development. In the lecture notes, there is description of a number of theories of development on the behalf of political scientists, and I would urge your attention to those topics. Um, we talk about modernizing theory, classical liberalism, classical Marxism, structuralism, which are all very important concepts that you need to study. On the other hand, we also talk about dependency theory. A scholar by the name of Dos Santos is the structure of dependence. What we mean by that is when economies of certain countries uh, are hindered or that their development is conditioned by the development and expansion of another country. In the 21st century, we see this in a dramatic way in Africa and other parts of the world where China is building many, many roads, highways to help countries, but that comes with a cost that they have to trade long term with China. They have to have certain arrangements with China. And so dependency is both, I would say, um, a challenge, but also it can become a danger. And I would encourage you to look at that and to spend some time with that issue. Well, it's time for you to engage the study notes and the textbook and to come to a more complete understanding of political development and political economies. This is one of the most exciting, one of the most important topics in international politics. However, as we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, it is also very confrontational. What kind of aid should a country give? What kind of aid should a country legitimately request? What is the role of the international community, the United Nations? What is the role of political economy, especially among the most developed and richest countries, and to helping those less developed countries. And this is an exciting topic, and thank you for sharing in this study.